Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on time series modeling. I am Behzad Nobakht, data scientist at Furthur National Engineering Laboratory, NEL. I joined NEL nearly 2 years ago, and before that I completed my PhD in petroleum engineering in Heriot-Watt University. So today I'll be presenting some fundamental concepts in multivariate time series modeling. And the purpose of this webinar is, firstly, there is a massive amount of time series data collected every day in almost any industry. And the other reason is that quantitative and qualitative methodologies for forecasting help industry to develop condition-based monitoring, or CBM, and also improve business strategies. And instead of going through many details in time series modeling, we will have a very high level, or let's say helicopter view on time series modeling problems. Well, I'll begin with a brief introduction about ourselves and who we are and what we do here in Scotland. And then at the end of my talk, there will be a Q&A session, as Marietta mentioned, and you could drop me your question in Q&A session. So yeah, so first of all, we are UK National Engineering Laboratory since 1947, also known as NEL, which is a subsidiary of Furthur from 1995. We are also UK National Measurement Institute for flow and density measurement. National Engineering Laboratory is involved in these areas that you can see in this slide: flow measurement challenges for industry, device calibration, industrial products, oil and gas, clean fuels, life science, water industry, and etc. Our focus tends to be flow measurements. However, data science, the sensors, and the instrumentation that we have are utilized through all industry, through any industry. Therefore, our methods can be applied to all industries. We work in oil and gas, but we are shifting our focus onto clean fuels, life science, as well as digitization. So here's a picture of our national laboratory. We actually have our own facilities here in East Kilbride, Scotland. Our own engineers design and maintain these facilities, which allows us to actually better understand our data from temperature sensors, pressure sensors, and other types of sensors, and also mechanical equipment that we hold here. And as you know, both sensors and mechanical equipment are standard components in all industries, which again, it means that the data that comes off the equipment and the analysis and data analytic techniques that we use here are applicable to all industry. So our digital services team, including myself, come from different backgrounds with diverse skill set, which we believe is a bonus for everyone who wants to collaborate and work with us. We're not just modeling the data blindly, we actually relate it to underlying physical processes. And our engineers here from different groups also help us better unveil and find more useful aspects of our data. So we know that we know what can affect data. So things like, say, electrical noise or missing values, we understand at that level before applying any data-driven technique. Our group is led by Gordon Lindsay, who is in charge of DAC software development, digital communication setups and designs, and etc. I myself am a data scientist working on data-driven modeling, uncertainty quantification of computer models, and also Bayesian calibration. And our mathematician, Yangfeng Lang, specializes in statistical modeling, data analysis, and algorithm development. So our group's main research project is a 3-year research project funded by the UK government, Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, known as BASE. We aim to automatically determine flow meters conditions or their operational state based on real-time diagnostics and based on operational variables and diagnostic variables. We eventually provide our end users with feedback intelligence diagnosis. Here I just pointed out different conditions that we test in our laboratories, which enables our models to be fed by diverse scenarios and therefore be more generalizable. You can see the likes of misalignment tests, cavitation, fluid density, and pressure and temperature effects in our facilities. So we start off with a brief overview of what time series basics and application are. We then talk about correlation analysis in time series modeling, the data preparation and reshaping, and how it is linked with the type of model. We then move on to see some state-of-art models in time series forecasting and also sequence-to-sequence prediction. And in the end, we have a case study where we use an autoencoder or encoder-decoder network to detect anomalies for different flow meters or for different calibration conditions. Again, the purpose of this webinar is to give you some insight on major considerations and key elements in time series modeling, and more specifically multivariate time series modeling, and not necessarily the best model that can be used for multivariate time series data. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the diagram, which is a general process we take when we approach our data-driven projects. The key thing here is knowing what objectives are beforehand in our customer's mind and what can be potentially done, what can be our future objectives as we go forward in our project, how and also some steps in the diagram, as you can see, have so much to share. Like it's not a very rigid workflow. Some parts of the diagram, for instance, EDA, exploratory data analysis, and feature engineering can be addressed at the same time or in the same stage of our data-driven pipeline. So many of these stages can overlap quite a lot. And so in time series prediction is an important area in machine learning. And there are so many prediction problems that involve a time component, because the real-time processes are indexed by time. And most of the industrial sectors actually record and collected their data based on time indexes. So what is a time series? A time series is a sequence of observations taken sequentially in time. And the thing is that the time interval can be either equally or unequally spaced. Mostly they are unequally spaced. They are not ordered by time, same time interval. Well, basically time series analysis accounts for the fact that data points taken over time may have an internal structure, or let's say a correlation structure these correlation structures should be known and should be accounted for in our modeling approaches. For instance, we have different application of time series data in sectors like finance, including stock changes, currency exchange rate, GDP of a country in every month or every year. In healthcare sector, we have electrocardiogram signals, ECG, or PPG signal, which tracks down patient's health condition. Or recently, as you all know, we have number of COVID-19 cases per day for different countries or for different cities, which is again another type of time series data. In retail, we have likes of product sales for a store, or in energy and utility sectors, we have patterns of supply and demand and consumptions. In manufacturing, we have problems like anomaly detection, condition-based monitoring, production performance. And so, for instance, if you look at the top figure here, we can see gas consumption in a region in the UK until a certain day, which is identified here by a black dashed line. So we train our model until a certain time, and we try to forecast the future. Actually, computer is used to feed those data and forecast the future consumption for that region in the UK. Another example on the bottom tells us about the average precipitation of a city per month, which is used in weather forecasting. So as we can see, we have time series data almost everywhere in all industrial sectors. So let's see what properties can represent the time series. First one is we like to talk about is trend. A trend, as you can see here, pertains to long-term progression of a signal. Here we have an upward trend in our univariate time series data. In the next figure, we have two variables, one going upward and the other one going downward, which these two variables are inversely correlated. And because there are more than one variable, we call these kind of time series data multivariate time series data. So one is going downward, one is going upward, and we like to see what happens in the future. The other important component of time series data is called seasonality, which actually pertains to periodic behavior and which are repeated throughout the time. Periodic behavior of the signals. For instance, here we have for every 10 days we have a repeated pattern, which is a clear sign of seasonality. And in some other time series data, we have both trend and seasonality, as it can be seen in this figure. We have upward trend as well as a seasonality. The other important components are cycles, which are repeated but non-periodic fluctuations in data, and also errors and autocorrelation, which we discuss in next slides. So we all know that every measurement is prone to either systematic or random noise. Here, I don't intend to go through the details of sources of errors, but just pointing out how a noise model selection can influence our predictions. Well, in many regression modeling problems, the noise is not parameterized inside the loss function. Therefore, our loss functions, such as mean squared error, estimates the standard deviation. It doesn't parameterize it as an unknown. So in this case, we assume that the noise is known to us. But in fact, the noise can be a model itself, as can be treated as an unknown, an extra unknown to our modeling approaches. Because actually the noise can have different behavior in various periods of time. So in this graph, we can see an observation data, which is this black dots. It begins very stable. There is not much fluctuations here. And once we go forward in time, we can see very high heteroscedasticity behavior in data. In this case, the standard deviation of data is clearly rising as we go in time domain. So if we use an improper noise model like Gaussian white noise model, which has a constant standard deviation, we can see what happens. So here we can see that in both cases of earlier stage and later stage of time series, where we have low fluctuations and very high fluctuations, the Gaussian white noise model just estimates a constant standard deviation, which doesn't make sense. So we need to use and find the proper noise model. For instance, this correlated noise model in orange that can track down the fluctuations of data, where we have low fluctuations and high fluctuations. So this is a very key consideration, and it can have enormous impact on our prediction intervals and prediction under uncertainty. So in time series forecasting, we mostly come up with the term stationarity, which means that the statistical properties or characteristics such as mean or standard deviation of a process generating a time series do not change over time. So there's a great tool. There is also a great tool to check the stationarity and see if the standard deviation or mean or any other statistical properties change over time. This useful tool is called autocorrelation function. Autocorrelation functions finds correlation within the time series and not between the time series. What do we mean by a correlation within time series or within time domain? The autocorrelation measures correlation between a time series and a lagged version of itself. So it just accounts for the temporal dependency or temporal correlation within a time series. So if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, we will see a clear downward trend in autocorrelation plot, which is a sign of non-stationarity. The other thing is that many of autocorrelation values on the left graph are outside the confidence interval or confidence level, which is a measure of, again, significance of correlations. Also, in this plot, we can see that there is a non-randomness behavior. The autocorrelation comes down here and then stabilizes, but never changes its behavior. So we can conclude that the time series has a high degree of non-stationarity in this case. In other cases where we have a stationary process, we can see that we only have an autocorrelation of 1, which is related to lag 0, which is not important because always the autocorrelation at lag 0 is equal to 1. But the rest of correlations at other lags up to lag 30 remains almost within the confidence interval, and they have a very random behavior. So we can conclude that this time series is stationary. So as we said earlier, the temporal correlation or temporal dependency are the correlation within the time series data at different time steps. Autocorrelation function pertain to a linear correlation. If we are looking for nonlinear dependency, there are some other metrics such as mutual information, which is a statistical approach to actually determine both linear and nonlinear relationship in data. And mutual information actually measures how much information is known about one variable from the observation of other variables. So in most cases, it makes sense to believe that the quantity measured at adjacent time steps are more correlated. And this is what we can observe from the top autocorrelation plots here. There is a high degree of temporal correlation up to lag 30 in almost all of our variables, And this is a clear sign of high autocorrelation in our data sets. We also have a partial autocorrelation plots, which measures correlation at a specific lag after removing the effect of shorter lag. So partial autocorrelation plots are also very useful tool for identifying the order of an autoregressive model. And for instance, in this plot, we can see that we have different degrees of autocorrelation, partial autocorrelation for different variables. And an autoregressive model can be used to actually model our data and then predict the future behavior of our data. But as we can see, if the number of variables rises, then it doesn't make sense to feed a different autoregressive model for each variables. And this is a key problem when working with conventional statistical techniques. So to capture different temporal structure, we can make use of both moving average and autoregressive models at the same time. In this case, REMO models or autoregressive integrated moving average models are among the most widely used approaches for time series forecasting. In an autoregressive model, actually, the forecast corresponds to a linear combination of past values of a variable, whereas in a moving average, we have a model that the forecast of this model corresponds to a linear combination of past forecasts. Basically, REMO models, as can be derived from its name, combine the two approaches of autoregressive and moving average. And the term integration, the integration part, actually is differencing operation, which tries to convert or transform a non-stationary data, time series data, to stationary time series data. The problem with the REMO model is that it only works for univariate time series data and finds only linear relationships. So it's impossible to work with hundreds of variables that we have in industrial sectors and fit an REMO model to each of these variables. And the other thing is that they also account for a fixed temporal dependence. And then we need to define, we actually need to define that beforehand. Another problem is the fact that they predict one step ahead only, while sometimes we might need sequence-to-sequence prediction and have multi-step prediction. And finally, they are incapable of handling missing values, which is very, very common problem in industrial data, industrial processes data. And these are all shortcomings of REMO model. So now, what if we would like to find a way to automatically extract those useful information from a high-dimensional data that we already talked about? If our initial analysis proves the existence of a temporal correlation, then we can use a feature detector, which we can see here, a kernel or feature detector that slides along the time domain. So we have a feature detector that tries to extract useful information in the time domain. And as it moves along, it extracts useful information from hidden data. In this case, in this graph, we can see a 1D convolution, for instance, a 1D convolutional layer, where kernel only moves downward and it doesn't move horizontally. because here we assume that the variables are uncorrelated, so we don't have a correlation here between these two variables. This is a key consideration actually in time series modeling. In some cases, we might have correlation between these variables which are adjacent to each other. So another key consideration here is data preparation and reshaping. In time series modeling, we need to understand in which dimension of the data or area of data the convolution or other operations should be applied. To do this, we actually split data sets to sequences of the same length or same time steps. Each of them have different features or different variables, as we can see here in this plot. So we come up with a 3D data, and the first dimension of this data, this reshaped data sets, is a sample. The second one is the number of time steps, and number of time steps for each sample, and the third one is the number of variables, as we can see in this graph. So this form of data reshaping can also be used for LSTM model, long short-term memory neural network models, as well as convolutional 1D convolutional model. We will talk about LSTM model later on in this webinar. We may also need a convolutional LSTM layer on top of our network, which then will require a 5-dimensional array. These type of models split each samples to actually subsamples and perform convolution operation in 2 dimensions, and at the same time use LSTM cells. These kind of models have become very popular recently, especially for video processing and video data. The interesting thing here is that you can configure convolutional LSTM model to perform convolution on only one direction. Depending on the type of problem you're solving, there are possibilities to actually prepare your network to account for one-dimensional convolution. So as we can see, the advantage of using neural network models here is that although you feed the network with a known length of sequence, the prediction can be done or can be performed for any size of sequence. So we don't have a problem with the limited number of sequences or limited number of time steps. And of course, the output can be of any length. So another important data preparation concern is how to arrange input and output sequence for the model, for our neural network model. The question is how to achieve a actually more consistent and more robust measure of model performance. The other questions are what should be the forecast horizon, and how many time steps is needed to predict the output sequence. All these questions should be addressed by a sliding window, or what some people call it as rolling window, or expanding window. Some people also refer to these data reshaping as backtesting. So a sliding window or rolling window is usually applied to high frequency data. When we have too many data points, we can use a rolling window and move along the time domain. And on the other hand, we have expanding window, which is used more often where the number of historical points are limited. They can be used for both single step and multi-step forecasting. So and also both supervised and unsupervised problems. So now a crucial factor here is validating our model or testing the generalization capability of our model, which is also can be related to the choice of training and unseen test sets. So any wrong specification of training and test set can have an enormous impact on our final model. In time series prediction, we have two major validation approaches: in-sample and out-of-sample prediction. So if I use the pointer here, so when we have test sets, which are these red dots here, within the training interval, we call this test set as in-sample test set because they come from the same data space. And once we move forward out with we get the testing set out with the training interval, this is called out-of-sample test set. This is a very standard approach, actually. Out-of-sample test set is a very standard approach to test the generalization capability of our model. So once we tested our model on an unseen test sets in sample or out-of-sample prediction, we need to know actually how far out our model can predict reliably. And in other words, our predictive domain should be proportionate with the model's capability. For instance, here we have some observations here, and we try to fit a model to data available up to this point. And as you can see, our model is able to fit pretty well until this point, but as we go forward, it goes far beyond our true observation. So we can see that our predictive domain here is quite narrow, and we can only predict up to limited time steps. As more data becomes available, our predictive domain becomes larger in all these cases, and our prediction becomes much more reliable. So it's very important to know the limitations and actually the robustness of our model in prediction beforehand and even after applying data-driven modeling. So let's have a look at some popular models in multivariate multi-step time series prediction. So first of all, we have recurrent neural network models which exploit the sequential nature of the data through the context of its previous state. This actually enables the network to identify trend and seasonality in data. And if we unroll the recurrent neural network cell, we can see that the input enters the network and then move forward at each time step. There are actually two major problems in recurrent neural networks. The first one is vanishing gradient problem, which is quite popular in recurrent neural network, and the fact that the other problem is that they only account for short-term dependency and not long-term dependency. So let's see what we can do to circumvent this problem. So not long time ago, long short-term memory or LSTM neural network was introduced to actually handle the shortcomings of recurrent neural network. As it can be derived from the name, the LSTM can capture long-term dependency as well as short-term dependency, because actually LSTM adds a memory cell into hidden layer, and the cell state derivative can then prevent the LSTM gradients from vanishing. So we actually resolve the problem of vanishing gradient, which was quite popular in RNN neural networks. So as can be seen from the figure, LSTM learns a function that maps a sequence of past observation to an output sequence, just the same as RNN neural network. So we can see the architecture is actually quite similar. The only main difference is that the existence of internal memory cell. The internal memory cell, as we can see from the picture, has a cell state here that actually controls the amount of information that get passed through the network, and there is a forget gate here that decides what information to stay in the network or what information to be kept in the network and what information to forget. And this actually addresses the problem of long-term dependency in RNN neural networks. So in some problems where we need to reduce the dimensionality of input data, or in some cases where we like to denoise our signals, we can make use of a type of models which are called autoencoders. Autoencoders look for the pair of encoder and decoder that holds relevant information. They actually minimize the reconstruction error when the decoding is performed performed in the network. So if we look at this graph again, we have an input signal, and in the encoding section, we try to extract the relevant information and compress the data and actually transform the data into latent space here, which we call it bottleneck. And again, we have some other layers which try to reconstruct the signals. So the length of output signals here is the same as input signal, as we can see here. And we can actually optimize our model by minimizing the error between input signal and output signal. And because we don't have any labels here, we just work with input. We call this technique an unsupervised learning technique. An alternative optimization is also used to learn the best encoding and decoding model for best encoding and decoding actually architecture for the model. So at each iteration, we feed the autoencoder with some data. We compare the encoded decoded output with the initial data, and then back propagate the error through the architecture and update the parameters of the network. The thing to remember here is that autoencoders are not generative models, which means that they cannot produce any new content. If we are looking for generating new content, we need to look for some other models like variational autoencoders or generative adversarial network, which actually sample the posterior. So here we have an anomaly detection case study that we had in the past in our group. The reconstruction error of an autoencoder model are calculated in this example, and based on these error distribution for each of the condition, or in our case each of the flow meters, we calculated an anomaly threshold. And we can see in this plot that percentage of anomalous data is different for each of these condition or each of these flow meters, although all the unlabeled data from different flow meters are fed to the networks at the same time. So as we can see from the plots, we can actually lower down the threshold if we lower down the threshold here, we cover more, we actually assume more anomaly in data. So we can build we can actually assume a threshold for a reconstruction error in the training stage. And once we move to the testing stage, we can use the same threshold to detect anomalies for completely unseen data set. And this is a very standard approach when dealing with anomalies. Then this is just a question of which type of layers or which architecture of network should be used to optimize our LSTM, our autoencoder models. We can use LSTM, convolutional layer, or both of them, or time distributed layers, and so on, to improve the generalization of our model. So the other thing is that we can actually test the generalization power of our model by use of synthetic data sets. So basically, we can generate synthetic data from a known distribution or from the output of the model and make idealized data like the blue dots here, and then generate synthetic data set. It's also possible to impose a noise on the idealized data. For instance, the red dots here in the figure come from a completely known noise model. So what's the use of it? When we impose a noise on an idealized data set, the statistical properties of that noise model is completely known to us. So we know how the model should respond when we actually have a very limited noise on the data set. So when we make our model, our data set idealized, we actually remove all structural uncertainty from data. So we expect the model to 100% recover the truth. But as we add more noise to data, we expect the model to actually struggle to find if we actually increase the extent of noise, we expect the model to struggle to find best prediction for our input data. The advantage of this is that using synthetic data is that they are very cheap and easy to produce, and also can validate our prediction results before deploying the model. Other usage of synthetic data is for oversampling of imbalanced data sets, which is quite popular. Which is a very common problem actually in time series data and data which come from different industrial sectors. So to sum up, in this webinar, we talked about the fact that because our data comes of sensors and mechanical equipment, our methodologies here can be applied in any industry or any industrial sector. Then we touched on some fundamentals in time series modeling and how conventional statistical approach struggle to deal with complex data sets or multivariate data sets. We pointed out the importance of data reshaping in time series modeling, and then we had some state-of-art neural network models for multivariate time series prediction and modeling. We also showed that autoencoders are capable of dealing with anomaly detection. We had a case study and talked about the necessity of synthetic data in model validation. And yeah, that's everything for today, I think. So thank you everyone for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Now let's see if you have any question to ask in the Q&A panel.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Behzad. if you just give us a couple of moments, I think we've maybe got time for a couple of questions. I don't know, Behzad, is there anyone there that you want to answer just now?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, there's a question here. Where can we apply a 2D convolution to the time series data modeling? So let's go back to this. Yeah. We have a multivariate time series data here. We can do a simple correlation analysis that tells us about the correlation between variables. Here we talked about correlation within variables, but we can see how different variables are correlated to each other. For instance, if sensors are, imagine if sensors are installed in different location of the pipe, they might have a correlation with each other. So we might perform a 2D convolution here, which performs a convolution in both directions. Here between time series data, and here for temporal dependency. So we can call it a spatial temporal correlation, where we perform convolution for both temporal and spatial correlation. Yeah, there is a question about the presentation. I think the presentation will be available to the public later on. Marietta can let you know about that.
Yeah. Yes, we send out the presentation and the recording, and you should receive that early next week. So yes, we do make that available.
Yeah. So I've got another question here. What is the best structure to model temporal dependence? So there is no specific model that can be, used for all temporal dependence problems. As I said earlier, you could design a network with varying number of layers, varying number of neural networks model with different configuration, different LSTM units, convolutional layers, time distributed layers, and see which one is the best model that suits your data. And we showed that with the in-sample and out-of-sample, you could actually validate your model. You can use synthetic data set to see which model performed better than the other. And recently, I came up with a model called Temporal Convolutional Attention-Based Network, TCAN, which has gained so much popularity. And this kind of model combines temporal convolutional network and also attention mechanism. So there are varieties of networks that are introduced every year, which are very useful, and you can apply to your problems.
Is there any others there, Behzad? I think we've maybe got time for one more. Otherwise, I think there's a few that have come in, but you can get back to them separately.
Yeah, there is a question here. Which tool do you use for time series modeling in your presentation? For time series modeling, if you mean the deep learning platform that I use TensorFlow to train our model, and I use some other tools to actually extract useful insight from the data. There are many open source libraries that allows you to calculate feature importance of your model, to do exploratory data analysis, and also do some correlation analysis and have some insights beforehand. And I think TensorFlow, both TensorFlow and PyTorch are now, both very competitive, and both have their own fans. So both of them are highly recommended for time series modeling of industrial processes. Yeah, there is one question, Marietta, if you let me answer.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
carry on.
Someone asked me, for anomaly detection, is there a way to have a method that automatically set the threshold based on the new incoming data? To answer to your question, there is a way to do that, but the way I do it, I look at the distribution of error in the training data. When we get the errors for training data, you can look at the last 1 percentile of data and treat it as anomalous data. So you get a threshold for the training data set. If you like to have a online model that can improve itself inside the actually when you have live data, you should apply more advanced modeling approaches like transfer learning, if you have heard of it. Transfer learning actually allows you to improve your pre-trained model when you get live data, and I think this should be a way to go for your problem. I have another question. If you don't mind, can I answer another question?
Yeah, sure. Carry on, Behzad.
Yeah, what sort of imbalanced data happen in time series? So let's say you want to train a model based on different conditions. You have 100,000 data sets for one specific condition, and for another condition B, you have 10,000, or even less, let's say 100,000. Or in banking, we have a fraud detection problem where you have most of your data are actually healthy data. There is no fraud in most of your data, and you have a severe imbalance classification problem. So for these kind of data set, you either need to oversample or undersample or both of them at the same time. And you could also use generative networks such as variational autoencoders to generate and oversample those minority classes. So there are many ways to deal with imbalance classification problems. I think it should be okay for today. No problems.